There are things we can all do. I mean, we're all, practically everybody here, I'm sure, is from a pretty privileged sector of the population. You have lots of opportunities. You can speak, you can write, you can organize, you can reach out to other people. If you keep doing it, it can have an impact. Take, say, something like the women's movement. I mean, a lot of you are old enough to remember how that happened. I mean, it began with very small consciousness-raising groups. Groups of women getting together and talking to each other and coming to comprehend, and a lot of it's internal, to comprehend that you don't have to accept oppression. That there is oppression, first of all. Like if you'd asked my grandmother, is she oppressed, she wouldn't know what you were talking about. Of course, she was hopelessly oppressed, but it just wasn't, that's life, you know, it's like asking, do you breathe? So just getting to understand that you don't have to accept oppression. You can be a free, independent person. And then came efforts to expand. And there was bitter resistance. You know, it wasn't easy by any means. And in fact, there still is. And there's a backlash and so on and so forth. But you just keep struggling for it. The civil rights movement, it didn't get anywhere near Martin Luther King's dream, but it did have effects. Big change from, say, Alabama in 1960. Not, you know, things that are bad, but not like that. And it's the same way. It started with, you know, it goes back decades, of course, but it really took off when a couple of young black students sat in at a lunch counter 60 or 51 years ago. They were arrested, beaten, and so on. Pretty soon, SNCC formed, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. The students got some support. In Spelman College in Atlanta, where a lot of the SNCC activists came from, there were two faculty members who supported them, Howard Zinn and Stoughton Lind, both expelled. But they did get some support, and the Freedom Riders, Freedom Buses started. There was little participation from the North. It was very brutal. People were killed, beaten, you know, not fun. I mean, I remember demonstrations as late as 1965 in the South, where there's just brutal police violence and repression. The federal marshals there kind of watching and not doing anything. But it did get some gains. It hit a limit. It hit a limit as soon as it reached the North. It's kind of striking. Martin Luther King in 1966 expanded the movement to Chicago. Then they were just dumped on miserably. It was an effort to mobilize the poor, mobilize people around slums. Moved on to the war in Vietnam. Huge antagonism. He ended up the way I described, just kind of written out of history by Northern liberals. But it did have success. And the successes are real, and we know how they were won. Same with everything else. The Vietnam War protests did reach a substantial level, but remember what it was like for years. I mean, when I started giving talks about the Vietnam War in the early 60s, it was in somebody's living room or in a church with 4 people, you know. And in fact, if we tried to do it at college, say MIT, you'd have to bring together half a dozen topics and make one of them Vietnam in the hope that somebody would show up. As late as October 65, that's after what Bernard Fall was describing, what I quoted, in Boston, which is a liberal city, you could not have a public demonstration against the war, literally. It would be violently broken up, often by students. That's a fact. In March 1966, you know, at this time, the hundreds of thousands of troops were rampaging in South Vietnam, huge destruction, country virtually destroyed. In Boston, again, liberal city, since we couldn't have public demonstrations because they'd be broken up, we tried to have one in a church, downtown church, Arlington Street Church. The church was attacked. tomatoes, cans, defaced. Actually, there was a police contingent. I walked outside and stood next to the police captain and asked him, can't you do something to stop the defacing of the church? He said, nah, I can't do anything. About a minute later, a tomato hit him in the face. In about 30 seconds, the place was clear. But that was going on in March 1966. A year later, there were big demonstrations. And there were no special kind of tricky strategies, just what we all know how to do. If people don't want to think about facts, try to bring out the importance of understanding facts, which after all, everyone knows. In fact, if you look at public attitudes, even Tea Party attitudes, they're kind of social democratic, literally. So for example, among Tea Party advocates, and of course the rest of the population, a considerable majority are in favor of more spending for health and more spending for education. They're against welfare, but more spending to help, say, women with dependent children. That's the result of very effective propaganda. Ronald Reagan, one of his great successes, was to demonize the concept of welfare. So welfare means, for Reagan, Reaganite rhetoric, a rich black woman driving to a welfare office in a chauffeured Cadillac to take your hard-earned money and spend it on drugs or something. Well, nobody's in favor of that. But are you in favor of what welfare actually does? Yeah, that ought to be supported. And I just don't think it's true that people don't want to hear about facts. I mean, the same is true on health, on the deficit, on the things I mentioned. Not 100%, but there's a fairly, for example, about, I think it's 2/3 of the population thinks that corporations should be deprived of personal rights. That's a pretty significant move. That would undo a century of court decisions. It's not just Citizens United, it goes back a century. And that's against the will of about 2/3 of the population. Well, all of these things offer plenty of opportunities for discussion, interchange, education, organizing, activism. The opportunities are all there. It's mostly the will to undertake them that's lacking. And it's not easy. I mean, there's costs associated with it. So, undoubtedly, even for privileged people. But, not the costs that people like us can't bear. Not that kind of cost.